Are we good?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. I just have, it says West Kingdom Zoom. Is that normal in the screen?
That's probably just that particular screen is up right now for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I see everyone.
Okay. Well, I'll start over again. I'm Clare Elena de Montfort. I live in Awertha in Chugiak, which is part of Sauvegarde, but I'm pretty active in Escalia. Um, my real job, I guess, is education. I teach middle school students. I've been an educator for 22 years and completed my graduate work in education technology and library science. So tonight, Elsie asked me to talk about the differences between teaching adults and children. And really, if you think about it, there's not a lot of difference in how we learn. It's just the approach to learning. And there's two big words, pedagogy, which we hear tossed around a lot in education world, particularly with young adults and elementary age children, and an andragogy, which is a word that was coined in the 60s, early 70s to mean teaching to adults. But really at the core of things, teaching to adults and children is the same in many ways. So to start tonight, I want you to think about the last class you took, whether it was at an SEA Collegium, something related to your work, and put your learner hat on. So as a learner, what did you spend most of your time doing during your learning experience? One, reading the test slides or handouts you were given. Two, listening to the teacher or trainer. Three, watching visuals of some sort, whether it was on technology, slideshow, a video, or something along those lines. Four, discussing concepts or practicing skills. Or five, teaching other participants and learning from other participants. So either in the chat or if you want to just call out what you did, what were some of the ways that you experienced learning for the most part?
So this week I spent some time listening to lecturers and reading slides.
Okay, and Refna says hands-on. Taking notes. Yeah, and that's one of the things I just want to point out that Zoom makes it very difficult. If you were in front of me, you'd have some paper in your hand. We'd be talking about note taking. It would be very different. After having to teach remotely for almost 2 years, I'm a little tired of Zoom. It makes it very hard. So taking notes, listening. So honestly, 1, 2, and 3 are how most people deliver training or education. And when we teach, we probably use 1, 2, or 3 a lot because that's the way most of us experienced learning. That's the way most of us went through education. And so we do it the way that we experienced it. So when we start thinking about teaching a class to adults, we want to ask ourselves, do we want our learners to hear it or learn it? And we have to think about those things differently because adults come into the learning experience very differently from young children. Adults want to know the why. Usually adults are learning by choice. They're there because they want to learn something. They usually have a goal in mind. So it's important for adults to know how all these pieces fit together. If you think about trainings that you have to go to, and as a professional development days or in-service days as an educator, sometimes I sit in a training and say, this could have been an email, or you could have just given me the material to read. And why am I here? And this could have been much more meaningful. The second thing that's different with adults from children is adults bring a lot of prior experience to learning. They're learning. Depending on your age, there's a whole lot already inside our heads that we bring into the classroom. Young children are coming in kind of as empty sponges that need to be filled up. And adults will tap into what we already know to help us learn something new. Adults like to be self-directed. Adults, when they're learning, want to be involved in choices. That it doesn't always happen, particularly if we're in some sort of education program, whether you're earning an advanced degree or whatever. We don't always get choice, but we like to have that choice. And frankly, adults already know how to learn. We all have different learning styles, and we adapt to those depending on what we're doing. Adults also have a readiness to learn. Our adult learning is usually focused on practice, application, learning a new skill. We're in charge of the direction of our learning. And we know it's the right time to learn for us. And I think something that's probably pretty true of this group in the SCA, because most of us are probably teaching in a collegium or to a local group. We already know what we know. We're pretty independent and self-directed, and we keep tapping into that prior experience. And adults know what they want to do next. You know, if you're at a collegium and you walk into a class about embroidery, it's usually because you want to know how to embroider. Or you're curious about what it is. So you're ready to learn that. Young adults and children are sometimes in a class because they have to have so many credits of math, or they have to have so many credits of English. And that attitude reflects in their learning experience. They're like, you know, I really don't even want to be here. They're not always ready to take in. The other thing that more adult learners, they want their learning to be experiential rather than content. And as I was working on this and thinking about, you know, what most of you are probably wanting is, how do I help be a better teacher, instructor in a collegium or whatever. We don't want content so much. We want opportunities to facilitate learning with the people that are in our class. And this is what's driving me nuts with this Zoom, because I'm doing a lot of talking. I like to have conversations. So at any point you want to jump in, share, ask a question, I'll try to keep track with raised hand, if you've got a raised hand. So the other thing to think about with adults is ways to facilitate a lot of different ways to deliver your content. I'm watching Elena working on her embroidery while we're talking. And sometimes adult learners need to be doing something with their hands in order for their brains to be processing. Sometimes young children need to do that too. I see you smiling, Elena. So as you're thinking about the class that you're wanting to teach, what are some ways that you can actually put things in your students' hands to help them with whatever content you're trying to deliver, as opposed to just sitting and saying, this is what you should know, or this is how it works. So, did you have a comment, Elena? Nope. One of the last things is adults have a lot more intrinsic motivation to learn than children. Some children are naturally curious, but what an adult brings to the table is that we've developed that intrinsic motivation to learn. We want to acquire a new skill, add to our toolbox, whatever the case might be. Any questions about some of those differences, or does it make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I really like the points that you've made so far about, you know, sort of the ideas of not just lecturing adults, being able to get them moving and doing things. That makes a lot of sense on what's worked for me and what hasn't in regards to teaching in the SCA.
And so, Elsie, your comment's a nice segue to the next thing I want to talk about, brain-friendly learning. Probably in the last, 15, 20 years, there's just been this exponential body of research and body of learning about how our brains actually process that flies in the face of what traditional education had been in the past. So the term that you'll see a lot, it's cognitive neuroscience. It's studying how our brains take in information, how we store it, how we retrieve it, how we use it. I saw that Genevieve made the comment that she likes to take notes. And there's now a connection between how we take notes and how we recall that information. Kind of just a little interesting side note. Children used to learn handwriting in elementary school, print and cursive. And then the education moved away from that. We don't need handwriting so much, blah, blah, blah. And then research started to show that there is a real connection between neural development and the manual process of holding a pencil and putting it on paper and making letters with that. That there's a direct correlation between how brains develop and that handwriting piece. And so now you see the swing of, now we've got handwriting without tears, and schools going back to teaching cursive handwriting, because the brain research supports that development, particularly for younger children. So traditional learning is sometimes brain neutral, or in some cases, brain antagonistic. It doesn't help us take in and process and recall and store information. So what is brain-friendly learning? So I'm just going to read off a list of things. And anytime you were doing any of these things, you were participating in brain-friendly learning. Think about sometimes you learn something just for the sheer joy of learning it. You were having a grand time, just having fun with a new knowledge. Learning when you wanted to learn it. Feeling a great sense of accomplishment when you finished whatever it was you were working on. You learned what you needed, when you needed it, and at your own pace. You learned by doing it instead of watching someone else doing it. And I think a good example of this is a pastry class I took at my very first culinary symposium. I have a love-hate relationship with pastry. I cannot make a pie crust to save my life. But the class that I took, the instructor got us started, paired us with somebody, and then stepped out of the way, and we worked together. I had a successful pie crust finally. I actually made a standing pie crust successfully. And I've not forgotten that. I still have my notes. I still have a very vivid picture in my brain of that experience. We learn by teaching it to someone else. You learned it in a formal environment where you're collaborating, working with someone. Think of sitting at events when someone's working on something and you sit down with someone else and they start asking you questions and you have an informal teaching experience. And I think more importantly, you chose how you were going to learn. Whether it's reading a book, watching a video, calling up someone and saying, hey, I know you know how to do this thing. Will you show me how to do this thing? Or I'm trying to do this thing and here's what worked and here's what didn't work. So just in that informal teaching, those are all brain-friendly ways to have people learn. Anyone have an example of one of those experiences in their learning? So let's see, Genevieve says, you took an online PMP class and listen and then taking handwritten notes. Elsie.
Riding a schoolmaster.
Yeah, having a horse teach you. When we don't have to remember all the pieces, and then we have an opportunity to see how those pieces fit together when someone else knows how they go. So designing something for one of our SCA collegiums or an arts and sciences day, or even just kind of being prepared to teach someone who walks up to you and asks you what you're doing, can be challenging to incorporate those brain-friendly elements. But I encourage you to think about the times that you learned something well and walked away saying, I feel comfortable that I can do this on my own. And those are the things that you want to try to incorporate in a class. There's 5 different things to help enhance brain-friendly learning. Positive emotional experiences. There's research that shows that the neural pathways that get laid down in our brain are actually deeper when we're laughing or enjoying our learning experience. Multisensory parts, using all of our senses, touching, seeing, smelling, tasting, as many of those things that you can bring into the learning experience. It's easy to do with cooking, which is what I like to do. Excuse me, but there's probably other ways in other arts or sciences that you can incorporate multisensory. Having variety in your instructional choices. I've said it once, it's really hard for me to do all this talking. I like to have conversations and sharing. So mixing up how you teach, getting people up and moving, active participation, people talking and collaborating. And again, back to those informal learning environments. So much of that as you can bring in or choose 1 or 2 to try and weave into what you're teaching. Let's see. Another thing too, sometimes what you're teaching is going to be very lecture heavy. Elsie, I think some of the things that you teach about horses in different areas of our time period is more lecture. So every 10, 15 minutes, have people stand up, stretch, turn to someone and say, hey, here's something that I've learned, or this is something I remember from the last 10 minutes. And so you have people talking to each other. That's another way that's different than teaching children. And again, you're moving, so your brain becomes more active as we move. And people are sharing. Maybe someone heard something a little differently than what you did. So here's an example that I wrote down. Stand, reach your arms up, and turn to someone standing by you and give a brief summary of what you've learned so far. Sit down when you finish. So then, as the instructor, when I see people sitting down, I know, okay, I can move on. In an active hands-on class, you probably don't need those stretch breaks, but even just a break to stop and say, these are the things that we've covered, or here's how I put these pieces together. Genevieve might like this. Learners remember what they write. So if there's a way to provide a graphic organizer to the participants in your class, even if it's just a blank piece of paper, and you say, use this to keep notes in the way you want, or maybe you want to have something more specific to help people organize what you're going to be delivering. The movement of pen over paper helps our brains remember what we're hearing and learning. And this I found interesting as I was reviewing some things for some of my graduate classes. Not only do we remember what we write, we also remember where we write it on the paper. I wish I did think to grab how I take notes. I just came back from a conference, and I always use a spiral notebook to keep my notes in. I don't like taking notes on a computer, even writing on my iPad. I like writing, and I write all over the paper, and I draw lines, or I'll star things. Visual spatial memory is a powerful way to remember things. So again, as you're designing your class, think about how you could provide a graphic organizer for people to keep track of what you're teaching. And also reminding people to take notes. I think in the past, note-taking was pretty common, but as technology has advanced, we don't take notes like we used to. So you might have to remind people, this might be something to write down. This might be something you want to remember. Remember that graphic organizer I gave you, or that piece of paper I handed out? This would be a good way to take notes. And just a note, if you're using a slide presentation, or handouts that you're displaying with some technology, don't hand them out until the end. Because people will think, well, I'll just read these and do it on my own. So give out all of your information at the end. I noticed that at the conference I just came back from, some of the presenters would give a QR code at the end of their presentation that we could scan that would take us to all of the links, handouts, anything that they shared. That's something, you know, if you've got a website that you put your work on, or maybe some directions or examples, put a QR code that people can scan and take with them. So talking about brain friendly, handouts are visually and cognitively boring. I mean, it's white on it, you know, black on white page. It's yeah. And Genevieve, you're not wrong that giving people a structure and handout enforces what you're saying. Just give them a blank page and have them write it down, and then give your handout at the end. And now they've got two pieces they can put together to make their learning stronger. So it's just flipping it a little bit. Let's see. If you're not sure about how to do a graphic organizer, you know what? Put the Google Oracle to work. That's what I tell my students. I say, you know, I said, well, let's inquire of the Google Oracle. Do a Google search on graphic organizers. You're going to get thousands of results, and you can take and put pieces together. You know, educators, I can steal with the best of them. I don't like to reinvent the wheel, but I can look at different things and mash things together to make it work for me. The other thing that I want to point out is visual aids and props are also good. Another culinary symposium class I took this last spring, a person was presenting on traveling foods, and they had tables set up across the front of the room with examples of the foods that they were talking about. And we had an opportunity to look at them, we could taste them. It was a well done way to reinforce the content of the class. And it made it a stronger, you know, here it is 6 months later, and I still remember those foods. I even remember where they were on the table. So that's you know, how our brains connect with things. So, okay. Well, I have 4 points to close out our time. So here are 4 C's to remember as you're designing instruction. Connections. Learners make connections with what they already know or think they already know about your topic. They'll make a connection with what they think they will be learning. They'll make a connection with what they want to learn, and they're going to make connections with each other. The second C is concepts. So as learners, we're going to take information in many ways. I talked about multisensories: hearing, seeing, discussing, talking, imagining, participating, and teaching it to others. So at some point in your class, could you say, turn to your neighbor and show them how to do what we've just been doing? So getting people to try what you've done. The third C, concrete practice. Learners are going to actively practice new skills, or they're going to review new knowledge they've learned. And the fourth C is conclusions. Learners summarize what they've learned. Learners celebrate what they've learned. Learners will evaluate what they learn. And here's something that I think would be a real strong thing for us to consider in our SCA teaching. Create an action plan for how they plan to use the new knowledge or skills when they leave the class. Having a goal or plan helps us to take it outside the classroom, because when we write it down, we remember it and what we want to do. So, questions, comments?
I have a question.
Okay.
So assuming the class is an appropriate size, a lot of times I'll open with asking, and I do this across the board, asking people why they're taking the class. Would it be better to move that towards the end?
Well, so here's something you could do, not necessarily towards the end. You could have people write, you could have a, rather than a discussion, have people move to a side of the room, do a brief little kind of warm up. Say, if you think we're going to learn about horse anatomy, stand here. So start triggering what they think they're going to learn by just having them move.
Okay.
And then just talk amongst each other and then move again. So that's not a bad thing to do, because as an instructor, that also helps you. You might have a plan and you realize everybody in the room has a different.
That is actually predominantly why I do it, because the stuff I teach is so unusual. There's usually 2 or 3 reasons people show up, and I can tailor it to whatever the audience is looking for.
Right, exactly. So I have a book, Elsie, that's called Teaching from the Back of the Room, that has a whole bunch of different warm-up activities to do with adult learners. It's geared more towards like professional development and training, corporate training, but there's really good things in there.
Cool, thank you.
So this is Genevieve.
Yeah,
quick thoughts on, we teach at collegiums, or I teach at collegiums.
Yeah.
And in the past, my approach has been, I have a lot of material and I've got 45 minutes. And so what I'll say is, hey, we're going to go through all this, but please, can you hold your questions till the end? Because I need to get through all this material, and we can have questions at the end. And now I'm wondering about that, because my stuff tends to be very lecture-y. And you're making me think I really like the action plan, the questions, maybe having questions, but also carving out some time at the end for action plan. I really like that idea.
And
just kind of the thought about keeping people from, particularly in the SCA, when people tend to take over your class.
Yep.
People have issues.
Well, there's a lot of strong personalities in our group, right? So one thing that might help is, when you do that stand and stretch and turn to someone, that might shorten the questions, because people have a chance to either correct misunderstandings or get a question answered by just having a conversation with someone else. And it takes you 2 minutes or less. As an instructor, you could control, set a timer. Timer goes off, everyone sits down, whether they finish the conversation or not. But it's helped people move, which helps them that sink into their brains. And it's given them an opportunity to talk to someone else about what you're learning. Let's see, I have, yes. So I happen to have 2 of the books there. Rosario asked, reading material. This book, Training from the Back of the Room, by Sharon Bowman, is a good one. And then someone else that I like, that I think particularly for us, is it's called Educated by Design by Michael Cohen, who's called the Tech Rabbi. And he talks about creativity and encouraging creativity and some different ways to do that. So it's worth, he's on Instagram. I don't know if he's on Facebook, but he's on Instagram and Twitter. He's worth following. I was looking at this book last night, and let me just, he talks about giving people creative confidence, creative capacity, and belief that they can do it. And usually that comes from a student's lack of experience. So if we can help people feel more confident in their own creativity, it helps them also with learning. And there's another book, Rosario. I thought I had a copy of it. I couldn't find it. It's called Worksheets Don't Grow Dendrites. But that's another one that's worth, if you can find it, reading.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
So, do you have any words of advice for classes where in the SCA where you're talking and you might have a mix of adults and kids? Like I'm going to be doing a newcomers class on Saturday.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've never ever taught children. So, any thoughts on a mixed group?
Well, I'm assuming maybe the children are there with their parents. And what content do you want to cover in the newcomers? What things are you going to be covering?
I'm going to cover, my focus is not so much the SCA itself. My focus is like West Kingdom culture, you
Uh-huh.
know, navigating court, knowing titles. And then my big thesis is understanding the idealism behind it all.
Okay. So for a lot of newcomers, and if we just think back to ourselves, I never knew how to address people. You could make a game out of it. You could have them practicing with each other, make a chart that has the different titles, and have them make up names and introduce themselves using a title. So especially if you've got children there, the more movement activity will help keep them interested. And adults that don't know really what's going on too, it's a little safer if you're practicing with kids, because sometimes kids have no social filters or care. And so the adult feels more comfortable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's an awesome idea. Thank you.
Yeah. You could even, I'm just thinking, there's a lot of shiny hats that walk around that people might not understand. Explaining like if you see a circlet that has the crenellations, this is what that means, or strawberry leaves, or pearls. I mean, just some of the things that we see walking around, what those mean. And one of the things that I always felt really uncomfortable when I first started playing was bowing in front of the thrones, empty thrones, when you walk by, or when a shiny hat walks by. Why is that part of our culture? What does that mean? And again, you can make a game out of it because that's a safe place inside the classroom. You could make a Jeopardy game almost. I'm just kind of thinking, and
That's
have
fun.
teams. Yeah. Do charades.
And I know the heralds used to train court herald. This is 1,000 years ago. The court heralds used to have fake courts. And it was like,
yeah.
That they made humorous. So yeah.
Oh. Any other thoughts or questions?
Well, I was just going to say, if we're out of the folks who are willing to go on camera, we may want to go ahead and wrap up the filming. Sometimes we have some folks that feel more comfortable asking questions once the cameras are turned off,
Okay.
or once the recording is done.
Sounds good to me.